Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask how best can political philosophers contribute to the fight against climate change? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge facing humans today. Scientists widely agree that global average temperature increases must be kept within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels to avoid potentially catastrophic outcomes. The politics, however, is lagging far behind. The UN estimates that governments' existing 2030 emissions reduction pledges would lead to temperatures rising by 2.7 degrees on average by the end of the century. Students of politics are therefore conducting a wealth of research to understand what's happening and what could be done better. But is that research actually doing any good? Is it contributing to better outcomes? Well, today we're going to focus on the contribution of political philosophy. Dr. Fergus Green is lecturer in political theory and public policy here in the UCL Department of Political Science. In two recent papers, he has argued for two kinds of paradigm shift in research on climate ethics, shifts that he argues would give philosophers' work greater impact. And I'm delighted to say that Fergus joins me now. Welcome, Fergus, to UCL Uncovering Politics. And let's begin by setting some of the context. You argue that political philosophy should change tack in order to maximize its impact. But how much impact would you say that research into climate ethics has already had to date?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think it's fair to say that climate change political philosophy has had some impact for sure. There are a couple of examples here. So I think the key one, and where most of the philosophical debate has been in the past, is around developing principles for distributing responsibilities for reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. And that could be distributing responsibilities among states or among individuals. For example, philosophers have debated the merits of the so-called polluter pays principle, and they've considered alternative principles like the beneficiaries of emissions should pay, or those with the greatest capacity to pay should be primarily responsible. And it's fair to say, I think, that those debates have definitely had some impact. One area in which I think they've had impact is in relation to climate change litigation, where sort of activist judges have tried to overcome the limitations of the lack of climate change law internationally and domestically, and are often sort of drawing on ethical first principles in order, for example, to consider how what a particular country's fair share would be in terms of reducing emissions. So I think that's sort of one example of the impact that the standard approaches have had.
Okay, great. So there's lots of useful work being done there, but your mission is to make it even better and even more useful. And you argue, as I said in the introduction, for two specific paradigm shifts. And the first of these, let's get straight into the detail of it. So the first of these is from what you call the pollution paradigm to what you refer to as a more holistic systems level frame of analysis, a phrase that only an academic could write. But so could you explain what the pollution paradigm is, what you see as its weaknesses, and what alternative you advocate?
Certainly, yeah. So just to be crystal clear, sort of what we're talking about here is the way that social scientists and sort of following them philosophers conceive of climate change as a social problem and how they understand it as a social problem. So the pollution paradigm has three main elements. The first and most important of which is a focus on greenhouse gas emissions per se. Now, there's no doubt that greenhouse gas emissions are the proximate cause of climate change. But what's distinctive about the pollution paradigm is that it's focused exclusively or primarily on greenhouse gas emissions in a quite a reductionist way that's divorced from the wider political, economic, technological, and social and cultural context in which emissions-intensive activities occur. So that's the first key assumption of the pollution paradigm. And the second one is that agents have extensive control over their emissions. And this could be whether they're individual human beings or whether they're collective agents like corporations or states. And then the third assumption, which is sort of not inherent to the other two or necessarily connected, but tends to go hand in hand. And this is the idea that emissions reductions are seen as costly burdens. And I suppose the idea is that there's sort of the assumption that rational individuals are doing things that benefit them. And so if we ask them to do something else, like reduce their emissions, then it's going to be costly or burdensome. And I think it's fair to say that this pollution paradigm has really held sway since the beginning of political discussion of climate change and continues to remain dominant today. Now, in recent years, social scientists working on climate change have really begun to question the pollution paradigm. And they've argued for this, as you say, more holistic and systems level frame. And so taking each of those assumptions in turn, so the alternative to the first assumption, instead of focusing on emissions per se, the focus of this, let's call it the systems paradigm, is on, obviously, systems and structures, right? So the structures within which agents act, the structures that kind of influence them to increase emissions. And particularly here focusing on fossil fuel intensive structures, agriculture and land use as well. But this could be things like infrastructure and other sort of material structures, technology, financial systems, laws and institutions, cultural values and social norms. And there's a recognition that these systems tend to be sticky, right? They're difficult to change. And this relates to the second assumption of the systems paradigm, which is that agents within these systems are constrained by them, and the things that they do are shaped by them, right? So it's not to deny that individuals have agency, but it gives greater recognition to the structural determinants of emissions-intensive actions, and also to recognize that different agents within the system have different degrees of power to change the system. And then the final aspect of this is, I think it sort of tends to go along with taking a wider, more systemic view, that we actually see opportunities for emissions reductions that might actually lead to benefits, right? Because we know that the systems that fossil fuel-based systems that produce greenhouse gas emissions often have a lot of other problems and cause a lot of other problems. And so if we take a more holistic view, then we can see that tackling climate change might produce a whole bunch of other benefits. So for example, it might lead to reduced air pollution. It might allow people to improve their diets or have greater access to green space. And there could also be a whole host of economic benefits to such an extent that we might even see, and arguably already do see, that emissions reductions could be beneficial even in financial terms. So that's really the sort of the two systems. And I think we're starting to see increasing work on social science of climate change that adopts this more systemic perspective. And whilst there's some philosophical work that does that, our paper is sort of trying to bring that perspective into theorizing about climate ethics.
Oh, that's really helpful, thank you. But just so that I can understand clearly, the pollution paradigm is focusing on what policies are needed in order to reduce emissions, and who the actors are who would need to pursue those policies and what the incentives are for those actors. Whereas what you're arguing is that actually we need to embed those actors much deeper in systems that don't just shape their incentives, but also shape. I guess that what I'm trying to understand is what are the things beside the incentives facing those actors that we need to understand those structures as shaping. So what's the structural, the systems approach kind of adding beyond the third element, if you like, of that pollution paradigm?
Yeah, so it certainly would include incentives. So I suppose one way of thinking about the structural paradigm or the systems paradigm is that you sort of go beyond the idea of sort of a single actor with their control over their emissions intensive activity, and you might look at the sort of technological or material systems that they're embedded in and the incentives provided by those. But as well as incentives, it's also things like meaning and identity that are sort of created in particular contexts. So maybe an example would help. So if we take the idea or the issue of passenger vehicle emissions. So the pollution paradigm would tend to look primarily at individuals as responsible for their emissions related to driving their vehicles. And in order to sort of think about what's necessary for emissions reductions in the vehicle sector, it will sort of look to things like, so how can individuals change their behavior to maybe reduce their mobility or their needs for mobility? And then how could they substitute either the fuels or the vehicles or even the modes of transport with which they get around? Whereas the systems paradigm, it might start by, for example, looking at questions of urban design and infrastructure. So it might ask, why do we have a prevalence of roads and highways and petrol stations? It might then look to the way that these infrastructures are often socialized, right? The costs are often sort of paid by the state. We might also look to the notion of car culture and sort of norms of consumption and images of the good life that are sort of saturated with automobility. And then we might look to particular actors rather than thinking about just individual consumers. We might focus our attention a bit upstream, looking at the automotive industry and the oil industry. We might look at their characteristics, their size, their capital intensity, their position within supply chains, and their political clout. So for example, their role in shaping these infrastructural systems and through advertising, shaping car culture, and also obviously sort of lobbying and contributing to political parties, donations and so on, that shape the policies that enable the subsidization of roads and highways and even oil production. So yeah, I think that's sort of one example that kind of nicely illustrates the differences in perspective of the two.
Yeah, and the huge range of things that you can focus on once you've opened up this different way of thinking about things. Great. So in the paper that we're talking about here, so you've got a paper co-authored with Ingrid Robains on this. And so you focus in specifically on one aspect of these structures, namely the ownership of the fossil fuel industry. And you argue that this is something that we should be concerned about when we're thinking about tackling climate change. Can you just lay out what your proposal is there and what the argument for it is?
Yeah, certainly. So I should start by saying that so this is this idea of kind of nationalizing currently privately owned fossil fuel companies is an idea that's been in circulation in recent years with sort of increasing force, particularly sort of on the left of the Democratic Party in the US and also sort of the left of the Labour Party in the UK. And what we really want to do in this paper is we sort of see this as kind of an example of a sort of more transformative and disruptive approach that is emblematic of taking a more systems level view by sort of thinking about the role of who owns key assets of the fossil fuel economy. And so what we try and do in this paper is sort of to bring the techniques and tools of philosophy to sort of scrutinize and evaluate the case or the best possible case for this kind of taking fossil fuel companies into public hands. And so the argument is sort of basically this. Now, we make two key moves that we'll probably want to come back and discuss in a little bit, where we basically assume some important conditions. And we assume a suitably motivated government, by which we mean a government that is sort of genuinely committed to achieving deep and rapid decarbonisation and doing so via various policies, including taking fossil fuel companies into public hands. And then secondly, we also assume that the government, if it acquires these fossil fuel companies, will have effective control over them so that it'll have a majority stake, it'll be able to amend the company charter and specify that it should be governed for public purposes and appoint a majority of the company's boards and therefore influence its strategy and policies and the composition of senior management. And we assume that these conditions will be sustained for long enough to do various things. And so what are those things? So basically, our argument is that a suitably motivated government that does have that effective control over fossil fuel companies will be able to sort of essentially have control over a bunch of actions to reduce emissions that would be sort of more effective than would be the case if these companies remained in private hands. And I can just sort of briefly summarize sort of what those things are, and they fall into roughly three clusters. The first and most important cluster of things that the government could do is that it could essentially manage the wind down of fossil fuel production consistent with the kind of timetables necessary to avert the worst of climate change. So it could cease all exploration for and development of new fossil fuel deposits, and it could phase out existing production, in sort of a socially responsible, climate responsible manner. And the second cluster of actions that it could take are sort of various other things that might reduce emissions or these kind of wider systems that fossil fuel companies influence. So, for example, it could reduce the direct emissions associated with the production of, say, all fossil fuels, but particularly oil and gas, so upstream methane leakages and gas flaring and so on. But it could also expand research and development onto sort of areas that kind of leverage fossil fuel assets in a way that could help to reduce emissions. So, for example, offshore oil companies might have expertise that could be used in the offshore wind sector. And then the other sort of example in this bucket is really ensuring that the public affairs and governmental operations are aligned with these aims of reducing fossil fuels, rather than, fossil fuel companies currently obstruct climate policy and repress a lot of local opposition to their operations. So, this would be sort of taken off the table, and this would sort of reduce a key barrier to climate action. And then the final bucket is about sort of various actions that the government could take that essentially smooth the transition, increase social justice in the transition. So, for example, ensuring that the companies pay proper taxes, don't engage in tax avoidance and evasion, have good relations with the workers and the local community, that they fully decommission their production sites and restore them to high standards of safety and amenity, and that they secure what we call a just transition of the workforce and for local communities. So ensure that workers are kind of well treated, that they're kind of retrained and redeployed, and that they're sort of fit for work in other areas, and ensure that the kind of communities are not left with these sort of burdens from unaddressed holes in the ground and so on, and that there's kind of local kind of economic capacity in other areas that's developed. And so we basically sort of say that the government could kind of do all of these things in the public interest in a way that private companies are not incentivized to do, and that as long as the government is suitably motivated and has that effective control, then it could do all of these things. And that really is the sort of primary benefit of public ownership.
And how much of the work, so in getting to the conclusion that public ownership would be desirable, how much of the work is done by political philosophy, and how much of the work is done by all the other empirical stuff, I guess, which you're dealing with largely by assumptions? You're assuming we have a benign government that has the capacity to act effectively. I think you're also assuming something that I think some economists, more sort of pro-market economists at least, would contest, that the government is competent, and that it's not the case that, for example, entrepreneurial spirit and all these kinds of things are things that you need in order to pursue the objectives effectively. So to what extent how far down the road towards the conclusion that public ownership would be better are you able to get simply through the philosophy on this, and how much of that journey is about the empirical material that you're dealing with by assumption?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we basically certainly wouldn't want to deny that there's a lot of empirics sort of underlying some of these conclusions. So what we really try and do is sort of bracket out, at least in the first really sort of 3/4 of the paper, bracket out that empirical complexity and make these sort of idealized assumptions, and then evaluate the case based on the idealized assumptions. And that way we can sort of separate the sort of more philosophical aspects from the sort of more feasibility and empirical oriented aspects. Because part of the problem, I think, in this debate is that these things often get mixed together. So, and I think one of the things that we do in relation to the philosophical aspect is to think about what the goals are. And so we basically adopt a sort of relatively minimal understanding of social justice and argue that if social justice is the objective, both in the process of reducing emissions and that we want to reduce emissions in order to ensure we have ecological preconditions for social justice, then then this is sort of the way to do it. And we also look at arguments from fairness and from democracy, which I didn't mention. So it's about sort of making the values explicit and then thinking about how this set of actions could contribute to those values. But then sort of to the more empirical aspects of the question, yeah. So what we sort of do is we basically say that in the last part of the paper, we recognize and we sort of bring back in some of the empirical complexity, and we say, okay, so to what extent are our assumptions of a benign government and so on, to what extent are they applicable? And if we relax those assumptions, what are some of the issues that we might need to grapple with? And what we essentially do there is kind of invite a sort of multidisciplinary conversation. So we're not arguing that under any conditions governments should nationalize fossil fuel companies. We're just sort of trying to argue look at where we need to kind of do further research and consider it in more detail. One thing I will say, though, is that it's typically the case, even in sort of mainstream climate policy proposals, that, including by economists, it is typically assumed that governments have the requisite motivation to reduce emissions and the requisite capacity to do so. So the most widely discussed climate policies are carbon taxes and carbon emissions trading schemes. And sort of the most pure economists will say we need a global emissions trading scheme or a global carbon tax. And no one some people do, but like these proposals are still very much mainstream, even though one might legitimately question the extent to which it's feasible for a global emissions trading scheme. Even at the national level, these kinds of schemes require quite a lot in terms of state capacities. And in fact, where these schemes have often fallen down is in some of the complexities of implementation, let alone the difficulty of kind of designing and enacting an ideal policy given the political economy constraints. So I think it's fair to say that at least some of our assumptions are at least on a par with other assumptions that are made in the climate policy literature. And we certainly advocate kind of scrutinizing those assumptions, and that goes for us as well.
I have a zillion questions, but I said that we have two paradigm shifts to deal with here. And if we don't get onto the second one, then we'll never manage to deal with it properly. So let's move to that second shift, which is actually really, it gets to the heart of how political philosophy is done. So this is a paper with Eric Brandstedt, and you argue there, in essence, that climate ethicists should descend from the ivory tower and engage in more fundamental ways than many have done, at least to date, with activists and with policymakers. Do you want to set out the argument?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to say, though, is to recognize that there are often multiple purposes for which philosophers philosophize. And, I think certainly the two most obvious ones are, first of all, to pursue truth or the best possible state of things, and as an end in itself. But I think the second one, particularly philosophers working on more applied topics like climate change, also do want in some small way to make the world better, not just to pursue truth. And what we say in this paper is that to the extent that philosophers engage in the second objective or take that seriously, then if they do so, we need at least more what we call engaged climate ethics. So that's just to sort of put a little bit of a nuance on this. We're not sort of saying that all philosophers should always and only do this kind of thing. But so what do we mean by engaged climate ethics? So I suppose it's probably easiest if we start by pitting it against its foil, which we call the principles first method of climate ethics. And this is a little bit complex, particularly for non-philosophers, but I'll try and state it as simply as possible. Typically, what philosophers doing applied work on climate change will do is they'll start with some ideal theory, so a set of normative principles that, if followed and if complied with, would instantiate a kind of just or ethically justifiable state of affairs. And they try and sort of justify these using sort of techniques designed to establish that these are things that everyone would agree with, or that no one could reasonably reject. And so they pitch them at quite a high level of generality. But they then argue that these principles are sort of morally binding on agents. And then at the second stage, they then sort of do what's known as non-ideal theory, which is they try and sort of take these principles and try and apply them to what they recognize is a sort of messier world where the kind of ideals are not feasible to instantiate, but they try and bring us closer to the normative ideal. And it's really that we're sort of arguing against, because we think that this kind of approach is, first of all, it's very underdetermined. So a lot of the kind of actions that real world actors will take will be sort of saturated with normative complexity. It's not just a matter of kind of taking the principles and applying them to the facts in front of them. And so we think that even these kind of non-ideal principles leave agents with limited guidance for how to deal with complexity in the real world. And another aspect of being underdetermined is that these sort of categorical duties are often issued to the citizenry in general, with little or no attention given to the role of particular agents of change and their positions. And I think less attention still is given to the thinking through the relationship between the theorist, the philosopher, and these agents of change. And then the other, I think, big criticism that we level against principles first theorizing is that it often ignores questions about the motivation of different actors, right? So often we know it's the case that those who are most powerful often the least motivated to act. And so we need to sort of find a way of engaging with existing stocks of motivation. And so we argue in favor of using, or the increased use of, engaged methods. And what do we mean by that? So we mean a way of doing moral or political philosophy that involves substantial interaction between the theorist and some actual or potential agent of change, where that interaction influences the content of the theorist's normative constructs. Perhaps it would help if I give it a couple of examples of the kinds of engaged methods. Yeah. So we identify 3 families of engaged methods, each of which involves, I think it's easy to think about each of them as involving a sort of combination of the traditional philosopher with a different kind of actor. So the first example is we call ethnographic engaged methods. And here it's sort of about combining the role of the philosopher with that of the ethnographer. And so there's been a lot of examples of this, particularly a recent resurgence of philosophers doing ethnographic fieldwork or using other situational experience as a basis for philosophical reflection about contemporary institutions or organizations and practices. The second category is we call activist engaged methods. And this is really sort of combining the role of the philosopher with that of the activist. And this is very much rooted in the politics of existing social movements that are sort of fighting against palpable injustice, and usually involves a conscious and explicit identification by the theorist with the cause of the movement that they're interacting with. And this is a rich tradition in political theory, right? Think of all sorts of critical theorizing, from feminism, queer theory, disability theory, racial justice, post-colonial theory, and so on. And then finally, there's, I think, a smaller set of examples that we call committee-based engaged methods, where the philosopher is sort of joining forces with the policymaker and as part of a multidisciplinary committee working through controversial normative and empirical issues and coming up with recommendations. So, yeah, they're really the kind of three examples that we have.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. And in terms of what you're doing as a philosopher here, is the difference between these two approaches, I guess, is it a kind of epistemological difference or is it an ontological difference? So, is it the case that you're just becoming better at getting to the principles through this process? You're getting to the principles in a different way, and you're developing a kind of richer conception of the principles through this process that then you apply when you're thinking about these issues? Or are you actually fundamentally getting at a different kind of thing? Are the philosophical outputs here different sorts of things from what the principles first approach is giving?
I think it's more epistemological. I think the primary benefit is engaging with actors who are themselves in morally interesting or morally difficult situations. I should say I'm focusing here more on the first 2 of the examples, right? Either ethnographic or activist methods. And the idea is, I think, that proximity to the agents could do various things, right? It could illuminate different understandings of concepts. It could illuminate barriers to moral conduct that particular agents face that we might not have otherwise known about. It could lead us to, it might lead us to make ontological discoveries, right? We might sort of gain a better understanding of our social world through doing this kind of work. And it might lead us to change our prescriptions or our evaluations in light of these various kinds of new information. And I suppose in terms of to use your language, Alan, the outputs I think are still sort of broadly similar. I mean, it depends. Different theorists take slightly different approaches. But at least insofar as one is interested in developing normative principles, then I think what's probably primarily different about the outputs is that they're more specific and they're going to be more sort of tailored to the particular situation that the philosophers engage with. And that may mean that they're less generalizable, and that's an objection that we engage with. And that's one reason why we don't suggest that this is the only thing that philosophers should do, that there's no doubt some virtue in having more universalizable and generalizable principles, but that we also sort of need more particular principles. So this is sort of, in a way, it's sort of a pendulum argument. We think maybe the pendulum's swung a bit too far in favor of idealized and generalizable but relatively abstract principles, and what we need is thinking through the kind of complexity and messiness of particular situations, and that's a particular benefit from this theorizing.
Yeah, and can you give us a concrete example of how one of these three approaches to engaged methods might work in practice?
Yeah, so I'll give an example of a project that I'm just starting to kind of develop and sketch out now that I'm hoping to engage with in the future. And this is to sort of combine probably the ethnographic and the activist aspects of engaged methods, doing field work and interviews with labour unions. So for example, I'm particularly interested in labour unions because I think that engaged climate ethics should be sort of engaging with actors that have some degree of power, but also that might be able to be motivated to act ethically. And if you think of sort of who are probably the most powerful agents other than governments, it's probably corporations, but they tend to be motivated by profit for various kinds of reasons that we all know about. Whereas labour unions typically have more complex motivations. They often have, their workers' interests at heart, and to some extent that might be aligned with corporations' interests. But they often have long traditions of having, wider social and even environmental interests. And so I think there's a sort of variability in the objective function or the motivation of labour unions that makes them an interesting site for this kind of engaged work. And so the idea would be to essentially, in my case, to do interviews, potentially some field work with labour unions in emissions-intensive industries and some in perhaps not emissions-intensive industries, and think about a whole range of sort of conceptual, normative questions relating to sort of how they conceive of kind of the moral demands relating to climate change, how they conceive of constraints on their action, and the kind of actions that they do take and potentially could take in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Well, we are going to have to invite you back once you've actually done that research in order to find out what you found. This has been really great, Fergus, and such important issues to be discussing, and fascinating to hear these cutting-edge thoughts in the field of political philosophy. We've been discussing two papers. The first was On the Merits and Limits of Nationalising the Fossil Fuel Industry by Fergus Green and Ingrid Robains, and it's available to read online in the Royal Institute of Philosophy supplements. And if you're listening to this on the day this episode is released, which is Thursday the 19th of May, then Fergus and Ingrid are presenting on the paper tonight at Foyles Bookshop on Charing Cross Road in London from 7 to 8 p.m. You can reserve a free ticket on the Foyles website. The second paper we were discussing is by Fergus Green and Eric Branstedt, and it's called Engaged Climate Ethics, and it was published last year in the Journal of Political Philosophy. We'll put all of those details for the papers and the talk at Foyles Bookshop in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be looking at the movement and resettling of populations, particularly in Iraq and in Sri Lanka. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was researched and produced by James Cleaver. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.